Hey there, awesome and non-virgin League of Legends player. You've come here to learn about the champions and their abilities, you say? Oh, okay. Well then, go ahead and settle down, and I will read to you every single League of Legends champion, ability, and its description. So by the end of this video, you will be more than knowledgeable to go and fight on Summoner's Rift. Alright, let's get started with Aatrox. Aatrox's role is a fighter. The difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. Now for his abilities. His passive is called the Deathbringer Stance, and it is, periodically, Aatrox's next basic attack deals bonus physical damage and heals him based on the target's max health. His Q, the Darken Blade, is when Aatrox slams his great sword down, dealing physical damage. He can swing 3 times, each with a different area of effect. His W, Infernal Chains, is when Aatrox smashes the ground, dealing damage to the first enemy hit. Champions and large monsters have to leave the impact area quickly, or they will be dragged to the center and take the damage again. His E, Umbral Dash, is when passively Aatrox heals when damaging enemy champions. On activation, he dashes in a direction. His R is World Ender. Aatrox unleashes his demonic form, fearing nearby enemy minions and gaining attack damage, increased healing, and movement speed. If he gets a takedown, this effect is extended. Now our next champion is Ahri. Ahri is a mage. She is rated 2 out of 3 stars in difficulty. Now on to her abilities. Her passive is Essence Theft. When Ahri strikes 9 enemies with her abilities, her next ability also heals her for each enemy hit. Her Q, Orb of Deception, is when Ahri sends out and pulls back her orb, dealing magic damage on the way out and true damage on the way back. Her W, Foxfire, is when Ahri gains a brief burst of movement speed and releases 3 Foxfires that lock onto and attack nearby enemies. Her E, Charm, that we all know and love, and we don't hate at all, is when Ahri blows a kiss that damages and charms an enemy it encounters, instantly stopping movement abilities and causing them to walk harmlessly towards her. The target temporarily takes increased damage from Ahri. Her R, Spirit Rush, is when Ahri dashes forward and fires Essence Bolts, damaging nearby enemies. Spirit Rush can be cast up to 3 times before going on cooldown. Now onto Akali. Her passive, Assassin's Mark, is when dealing spell damage to an enemy creates a ring of energy around them. Exiting that ring empowers Akali's next auto attack with bonus range and damage. Her Q, 5-point strike, is when Akali throws 5 kunai, dealing damage based on her bonus attack damage and ability power and sling. Her W, Twilight Shroud, is when Akali drops a cover of smoke and briefly gains movement speed. While inside the shroud, Akali becomes invisible and unable to be selected by enemy spells and attacks. Attacking or using abilities will briefly reveal her. Her E, Shuriken Flip, is when she backflips backwards and fires a shuriken forward, dealing magic damage. The first enemy or smoke cloud hit is marked. Recast to dash to the marked target, dealing additional damage. Her R, Perfect Execution, is when Akali leaps in a direction, damaging enemies she strikes. Recast, Akali dashes in a direction, executing all enemies she strikes. Onto our next champion, Alistar. His role is a tank, and he is rated 2 out of 3 stars in difficulty. His bio is always a mighty warrior with a fearsome reputation. Alistar seeks revenge for the death of his clan at the hands of the Noxian Empire. Though he was enslaved and forced into life of a guardian, his unbreakable will was what kept him from truly becoming a beast. Now, free of the chains of his former masters, he fights in the name of downtrodden and the disadvantaged, his rage as much as a weapon as his horns, hooves, and his fist. Now onto his abilities. Alistar's passive is Triumphant Roar. Alistar charges his roar by stunning or displacing enemy champions, or when nearby enemies die. When fully charged, he heals himself and all nearby allied champions. His Q is Pulverize. Alistar smashes the ground, dealing damage to nearby enemies and tossing them into the air. His W, Headbutt, is when Alistar rams a target with his head, dealing damage and knocking the target back. His E, Trample, is when Alistar tramples nearby enemy units, ignoring unit collision and gaining stacks if he damages an enemy champion. At full stacks, Alistar's next basic attack against an enemy champion deals additional magic damage and stuns them. And lastly, his ult, Unbreakable Will, is when Alistar lets out a wild roar, removing all crowd control effects on himself and reducing incoming physical and magical damage for the duration. Onto our next champion, Amumu. His role is a tank, and he is rated 1 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. Legend claims that Amumu is a lonely and melancholy soul from ancient Shurima, roaming the world in search of a friend. Doomed by an ancient curse to remain alone forever, his touch is death, his affection is ruin. Those who claim to have seen him describe a living cadaver, small in stature and wrapped in creepy bandages. Amumu has inspired myths, songs, and folklore told and retold for generations, such that it is impossible to separate truth from fiction. Amumu's abilities. Firstly, his passive Cursed Touch. Amumu's basic attacks curse his enemies, causing them to take bonus true damage from incoming magic damage. His Q is Bandage Toss. Amumu tosses a sticky bandage at a target, stunning and damaging the target while he pulls himself to them. His W, Despair. Overcome by anguish, nearby enemies lose a percentage of their maximum health each second and have their curses refreshed. His E is Tantrum. Permanently reduces the physical damage Amumu would take. Amumu can unleash his rage, dealing damage to surrounding enemies. Each time Amumu is hit, the cooldown on Tantrum is reduced by 0.5 seconds. His R, Curse of the Sad Mummy, is when Amumu entangles surrounding enemy units and bandages, applying his curse, damaging and stunning them. Now our next champion is Anivia. Anivia's role is a mage, and she is rated 3 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. Anivia is a benevolent winged spirit who endures endless cycles of life, death, and rebirth to protect the Freljord. A demigod born of unforgiving ice and bitter winds, she wields those elemental powers to thwart any who dare disturb her homeland. Anivia guides and protects the tribes of the harsh north, who revere her as a symbol of hope and a portent of great change. She fights with every ounce of her being, knowing that through her sacrifice, her memory will endure, and she will be reborn into new tomorrow. Now her passive is Rebirth. Upon taking fatal damage, Anivia reverts to an egg and is reborn with full health. Her Q, Flash Frost. Anivia brings her wings together and summons a sphere of ice that flies towards their opponents, chilling and damaging anyone in its path. When the sphere explodes, it does moderate damage in a radius, stunning anyone in the area. Her W, Crystallize, is when Anivia condenses the moisture in the air into an impassable wall of ice to block all movements. This wall only lasts a short duration before it melts. Her E, Frostbite, is with a flap of her wings, Anivia blasts a freezing gust of wind at her target, dealing damage. If the target was recently hit by flash frost or damaged by a fully formed glacial storm, this damage they take is doubled. And her R is Glacial Storm. Anivia summons a driving rain of ice and hail to damage her enemies and slow their advance. The next champion is Annie. Annie is a mage with difficulty rated 2 out of 3 stars. Dangerous yet disarmingly precious, Annie is a child mage with immense pyromantic power. Even in the shadows of the mountains north of Noxus, she is a magical outlier. Her natural affinity for fire manifested early in life through unpredictable emotional outbursts, though she eventually learned to control these playful tricks. Her favorite includes the summoning of her beloved teddy bear, Tibbers, as a fiery protector. Lost in the perpetual innocence of childhood, Annie wanders the dark forest, always looking for someone to play with. Her passive, Pyromania, is after casting 4 spells. Annie's next offensive spell will stun the enemy. Her Q, Disintegrate, Annie hurls a mana-infused fireball, dealing damage and refunding the mana cost if it destroys the target. Her W, Incinerate, is when Annie casts a blasting cone of fire, dealing damage to all enemies in the area. Her E, Molten Shield, grants Annie or another ally a shield, a burst in movement speed, and damaging enemies who attack her with basic attacks. And lastly, her ult, Summon Tibbers. Annie wills her bear Tibbers to life, dealing damage to units in the area. Tibbers can attack and also burn enemies that stand near him. Next is Aphelios. And for the champions past this point, I will not read their description, only their abilities and their ability descriptions. Now, Aphelios' role is a marksman. His difficulty is 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, the Hitman and the Seer. Aphelios wields 5 Lunari weapons made by his sister Alune. He has access to 2 at a time, 1 main hand and 1 offhand. Each weapon has a unique basic attack and activated ability. Attacks and abilities consume a weapon's ammo. When out of ammo, Aphelios discards this weapon and Alune summons the next of the 5. His Q, Weapon Abilities. Aphelios has 5 different activated abilities. Based on his main hand weapon, Calibrum, long-range shots that mark its target for a long-range follow-up attack. Severum, run fast while attacking nearby enemies with both weapons. Gravitum, lure all enemies slowed by this weapon. Infernum, blast enemies in a cone and attack them with your offhand weapon. And Crescendum, deploy a sentry that shoots your offhand weapon. Now his W, Phase, Aphelios swaps his main handgun with his offhand gun, replacing his basic attack and activated ability. E, Weapon Q System. Aphelios has no third ability. This slot shows the next weapon Alune will give him. Weapon order begins fixed, but may change over game time. When a weapon is out of ammo, it goes to the end of the order. And his ult, Moonlight Vigil. Fire a concentrated blast of moonlight that affects an enemy champion. Applies the unique effect of Aphelios' main hand gun. Our next champion is Ashe. Ashe is a marksman, rated 2 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. Her Q, Frost Shot. Ashe's attacks slow their target, causing her to deal increased damage to these targets. Ash's critical strikes deal no bonus damage but apply an empowered slow to the target. Her Q, Ranger's Focus. Ash builds up focus by attacking. At maximum focus, Ash can cast Ranger's Focus to consume all stacks of focus, temporarily increasing her attack speed and transforming her basic attack into a powerful flurry for the duration. Her W, Volley. Ash fires arrows in a cone for increased damage. Also applies Frost Shot. Her E, Hawk Shot. Ash sends her Hawk Spirit on a scouting mission anywhere on the map. Her R, Enchanted Crystal Arrow. Ash fires a missile of ice in a straight line. If the arrow collides with an enemy champion, it deals damage and stuns the champion, stunning for longer the further the arrow has traveled. In addition, surrounding enemy units take damage and are slowed. Next up, Aurelian's Soul. His role is a mage. His difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Center of the Universe, stars orbit Aurelian's Soul, dealing magic damage when they hit an enemy. His Q, Star Surge. Aurelian's Soul creates an expanding disc which explodes to stun and surround enemies when it moves too far away from him. His W, Celestial Expansion. Aurelian's Soul pushes his stars further out, increasing their damage and speed. His E, Comet of Legend. Aurelian's Soul takes off flying for a long distance. His R, Voice of Light. Aurelian's Soul projects a blast of pure starfire, damaging and slowing all enemies caught in it, and knocking nearby enemies back to a safer distance. Next up, Azir. His role is a mage, and his difficulty is 3 out of 3 stars. Azir's passive, Shurima's Legacy, makes it to where Azir can summon the Disc of the Sun from the ruins of allied or enemy turrets. His Q, Conquering Sands, is when Azir sends all sand soldiers toward a location. Sand soldiers deal magic damage to enemies they pass through and apply a slow for 1 second. His W, Arise. Azir summons a sand soldier to attack nearby targets for him, replacing his basic attack against targets with the soldier's range. Their attacks deal magic damage to the enemies in the line. Arise also passively grants attack speed to Azir and his sand soldiers. Shifting Sands. Azir shields himself briefly and dashes to one of his sand soldiers, damaging enemies. If he hits an enemy champion, he instantly readies a new sand soldier for deployment and halts his dash. R, Emperor's Divide. Azir summons a wall of soldiers which charge forward, knocking back and damaging enemies. Next up, Bard. Bard role is a support, and his difficulty is 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, Traveler's Call, gives him memes. And Bard attracts lesser spirits that assist with his basic attack to deal extra magic damage. When Bard has collected enough chimes, his meeps will also deal damage in an area and slow enemies hit. Chimes, ancient chimes randomly appear for Bard to collect. These grant experience, maximum mana, and out of combat movement speed effects. His Q, Cosmic Binding. Bard fires a missile which will slow the first enemy struck and continue onward. If it strikes a wall, it will deal the addition. If it strikes a wall, it will stun the initial target, and if it strikes an enemy, it will stun them both. W, Caretaker Shrine. Reveals a healing shrine which powers up over a short time, disappearing after healing and speeding up the first ally that touches it. His E, Magical Journey, is when Bard opens a portal in nearby terrain. Allies and enemies alike can take a one-way trip through the terrain by moving into that portal. And his R, Tempered Fate. Bard sends spirit energy arcing to a location, putting all champions, minions, monsters, and turrets hit into stasis for a brief time. Next up, Blitzcrank. Blitzcrank role is a tank, and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. Blitzcrank passive is Mana Barrier. Blitzcrank gains a shield based on his mana when dropping to low health. His Q, Rocket Grab, is when Blitzcrank fires his right hand to grab an opponent on its path, dealing damage and dragging it back to him. His W, Overdrive, is when Blitzcrank supercharges himself to get dramatically increased movement and attack speed. He is temporarily slowed after the effect ends. His E, Power Fist. Blitzcrank charges up his fist to make his next attack deal double damage and pop his target up in the air. His R, Static Field. Enemies attacked by Blitzcrank are marked and take lightning damage after 1 second. Additionally, Blitzcrank can activate this ability to remove nearby enemy shields, damage them, and silence them briefly. Next up, Brand. Brand's role is a mage, and he has 2 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. His passive, Blaze, his Brand spells light his targets ablaze, dealing damage over 4 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. If Brand kills an enemy while it is ablaze, he regains mana. When Blaze recharges max stacks on a champion, siege minion, or large monster, it becomes unstable. It detonates in 2 seconds, dealing spell effects and dealing massive damage in an area around the victim. His Q, Seer, is when Brand launches a ball of fire forward that deals magic damage. If the target is ablaze, Seer will stun the target for 1.5 seconds. His W, Pillar of Flame. After a short delay, Brand creates a pillar of flame at a target area, dealing magic damage to enemy units within the area. Units that are ablaze take an additional 25% damage. His E, Conflagration. Brand conjures a powerful blast at his target that spreads to nearby enemies, dealing magic damage. If the target is ablaze, Conflagration spread is doubled. Pyroclasm, his ults. Brand unleashes a devastating torrent of fire that bounces up to 5 times off of Brand and nearby enemies, dealing magic damage to enemies each time it bounces. Bounces prioritize stacking Blaze to max on champions. If a target is ablaze, Pyroclasm will briefly slow them. Next up, Braum. Braum's role is a support, and he is rated 1 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. His passive, Concussive Blows, are when Braum's basic attacks apply concussive blows. Once the first stack is applied, ally basic attacks also stack concussive blows. Upon reaching 4 stacks, the target is stunned and takes magic damage. For the next few seconds, they cannot receive new stacks, but take bonus magic damage from Braum's attacks. His Q, Winter's Bite. Braum propels a freezing ice from his shield, slowing and dealing magic damage. Applies a stack of concussive blows as well. His W, Stand Behind Me. Braum leaps to a target ally, champion, or minion. On arrival, Braum and the ally gain armor and magic resist for a few seconds. His E, Unbreakable. Braum raises his shield in a direction for several seconds, intercepting all projectiles, causing them to hit and be destroyed. He negates the damage of the first attack completely and reduces the damage of all subsequent attacks from this direction. His R, Glacial Fissure. Braum slams the ground, knocking up enemies nearby and in front of him. A fissure is left along the line that slows enemies. Next champion is Caitlyn. Caitlyn is a marksman with 2 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. Her passive, Headshot, every few basic attacks or against a target she has trapped or netted, Caitlyn will fire a headshot, dealing bonus damage that scales with her critical strike chance. On damage or netted targets, Caitlyn's headshot attack range is doubled. Q. Piltover Peacemaker. Caitlyn revs up her rifle for 1 second to unleash a penetrating shot that deals physical damage. W. Yordle Snap Trap. Caitlyn sets a trap to find sneaky Yordles. When sprung, the trap reveals and immobilizes the enemy champion for 1.5 seconds, granting Caitlyn an empowered headshot. Her E. 90 caliber net. Caitlyn fires a heavy net to slow her target. The recoil knocks Caitlyn back. Her ult, Ace in the Hole. Caitlyn takes time to line up a perfect shot, dealing massive damage to a single target at a huge range. Enemy champions can intercept the bullet for their ally. Next up, Camille. Camille's role is a fighter, and she is rated 2 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. Camille's passive, Adaptive Defenses. Basic attacks on champions grant a shield equal to a percentage of Camille's maximum health against their damage type, physical or magic, for a brief duration. Her Q, Precision Protocol. Camille's next attack deals bonus damage and grants bonus movement speed. This attack can be recast for a short period of time, doing significantly increased bonus damage if Camille delays a period of time between the 2 attacks. Her W, Tactical Sweep. Camille blasts in a cone after a delay, dealing damage. Enemies in the outer half are slowed and take extra damage, while also healing Camille. Her E, Hook Shot. Camille pulls herself to a wall, leaping off and knocking enemy champions upon landing. Her R, the Hextech Ultimatum. Camille dashes to a target enemy, anchoring them to the area. She also deals magic damage to the target with her basic attacks. Our next champion is Cassiopeia. Her role is a mage, and her difficulty is 3 out of 3 stars. Her passive, Serpentine Grace. Cassiopeia gains movement speed per level, but she cannot purchase boot items. Her Q, Noxious Blast. Cassiopeia blasts an area with poison after a brief delay, granting her increased movement speed if she hits an enemy champion. Her W, Miasma. Cassiopeia releases several clouds of poison, slowing, grounding, and lightly damaging champions that pass through them. Grounded enemies cannot use movement abilities. Her E, Twin Fang. Cassiopeia lets loose an attack that deals increased damage to poison targets and heals her for a percentage of the damage dealt. If the target dies from this attack, Cassiopeia regains mana. Her R, Petrifying Gaze. Cassiopeia releases a swirl of magical energy from her eyes, stunning any enemies in front of her that are facing her and slowing any others with their back turned. Next up, Cho'Gath. Cho'Gath's role is a tank, and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Carnivore, is whenever Cho'Gath kills a unit, he recovers health and mana. This value restored increase with Cho'Gath's level. Next up, his Q, Rupture. Ruptures the ground at target location, popping enemy units into the air, dealing damage and slowing them. His W, Feral Scream, is when Cho'Gath unleashes a terrible scream at enemies in a cone, dealing magic damage and silencing enemies for a few seconds. His E, Vorpal Spikes. Cho'Gath's attacks release deadly spikes, dealing damage and slowing all enemy units in front of him. And his R, Feast, is when Cho'Gath devours an enemy unit, dealing a high amount of true damage. If the target is killed, Cho'Gath grows, gaining maximum health. Next up, Corki. Corki's role is a marksman, and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Hextech Munitions. A percentage of Corki's basic attack damage is converted into magic damage. Corky can occasionally retrieve the package inside his base, granting him movement speed and an empowered cast of Valkyrie. His Q, Phosphorus Bomb, is when Corky fires a flash bomb at a target location, dealing magic damage to enemies in that area. This attack additionally reveals units in the area for duration. His W, Valkyrie, Corky flies a short distance, dropping bombs that create a trail of fire that damages opponents who remain in it. His E, Gatling Gun, Corky's Gatling Gun rapidly fires at a cone in front of him, dealing damage and reducing enemy armor and magic resist. His ult, Missile Barrage, is when Corky fires a missile towards his target location that explodes on impact, dealing damage to enemies in an area. Corky stores missiles over time up to a maximum. Every third missile fired will be a big one, dealing extra damage. Next up, Darius. Darius' role is a fighter, and his difficulty is 1 out of 3 stars. Darius' passive is Hemorrhage. Darius' attacks and damaging abilities cause enemies to bleed for physical damage over 5 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. His Q, Decimates. Darius winds up and swings his axe in a wide circle. Enemies struck by the blade take more damage than those struck by the handle. Darius heals based on enemy champions and large monsters hit by the blade. His W, Crippling Strike. Darius' next attack strikes an enemy's crucial artery. As they bleed out, their movement speed is slowed. His E, Apprehend. Darius hones his axe, passively causing his physical damage to ignore a percentage of his target's armor. When activated, Darius sweeps up his enemies with his axe's hook and pulls them to him. His R, Noxian Guillotine. Darius leaps to an enemy champion and strikes a lethal blow, dealing true damage. This damage is increased for each stack of hemorrhage on the target. If Noxian Guillotine is a killing blow, its cooldown is refreshed for a brief duration. Next up, Diana. Diana's role is a fighter, and her difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. Her passive, Moonsilver Blade. Every third strike cleaves nearby enemies for an additional magic damage. After casting a spell, Diana gains attack speed for her next 3 attacks. Her Q, Crescent Strike, unleashes a bolt of lunar energy in an arc, dealing magic damage. Afflicts enemies struck with moonlight, revealing them if they are not stealthed for 3 seconds. Her W, Pale Cascade. Diana creates 3 orbiting spheres that detonate on contact with enemies to deal damage in an area. She also gains a temporary shield that absorbs damage. If her 3rd sphere detonates, the shield gains additional strength. Her E, Lunar Rush. She becomes the living embodiment of the vengeful moon, dashing to an enemy and dealing magic damage. Lunar Rush has no cooldown when used to dash to an enemy afflicted with moonlight. All the other enemies will have moonlight debuff removed regardless of whether they were a target of Lunar Rush. Her R, Moonfall. Diana reveals and draws in all nearby enemies and slows them. If Diana pulls in 1 or more enemy champions, the moonlight crashes down on her after a short delay, dealing magic damage to an enemy to an area around her, increased for each target beyond the first pulled. Next up is Mundo. Mundo's role is a fighter, and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Adrenaline Rush. Dr. Mundo regenerates 0.3% of his maximum health each second. His Q, Infected Cleaver. Dr. Mundo hurls his cleaver, dealing damage equal to a portion of his target's current health and slowing them for a short time. Dr. Mundo delights in the suffering others, so he returns a portion of his health cost when successfully land the cleaver. His W, Burning Agony. Dr. Mundo drains his health to reduce the duration of disables and deal continual damage to nearby enemies. His E, Masochism, Dr. Mundo gains bonus attack damage based on his missing health, and his next basic attack headbutts his target for additional damage, passively increasing his magic resist whenever Dr. Mundo is dealt magic damage or pays a healthy cost. His R, Sadism, Dr. Mundo sacrifices a portion of his health for increased movement speed and drastically increased health regeneration. Next up, Draven. Draven's role as a marksman as difficulty is rated 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, League of Draven. Draven gains fans' adoration when he catches a spinning axe or kills a minion, monster, or tower. Killing enemy champions grants Draven bonus gold based on how much adoration he has. His Q, Spinning Axe. Draven's next attack will deal bonus physical damage. This axe will ricochet off the target high up into the air. If Draven catches it, he automatically readies another spinning axe. Draven can have 2 spinning axes at once. His W, Blood Rush. Draven gains increased movement speed and attack speed. The movement speed bonus decreases rapidly over its duration. Catching a spinning axe will refresh the cooldown of Blood Rush. His E, Stand Aside. Draven throws his axes, dealing physical damage to targets hit and knocking them aside. Targets hit are slowed. And his R, Rolling Death. Draven hurls 2 massive axes that deal physical damage to each unit struck. Whirling Death will slowly reverse directions and return to Draven after striking an enemy champion. Draven may also activate this ability while the axes are in flight to cause it to return early. Deals less damage for each unit hit and resets when the axes reverse direction. Next up, Echo. Echo's role is an assassin, and his difficulty is rated 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, C Drive Resonance. Every third attack or damaging spell on the same target deals bonus magic damage and grants Echo a burst of speed if the target is a champion. His Q, Time Winder. Echo throws a temporal grenade that expands into a time distortion field upon hitting an enemy champion, slowing and damaging anyone caught inside. After a delay, the grenade rewinds back to Echo, dealing damage on its return. His W, Parallel Convergence. Echo's basic attacks deal bonus damage health to low health enemies. He can cast Parallel Convergence to split the timeline, creating an anomaly after a few seconds that slows enemies caught inside. If Echo enters the anomaly, he gains shielding and stuns enemies by suspending them in time. His E, Phase Dive. Echo rolls evasively while charging up his Z Drive. His next attack deals bonus damage and warps reality, teleporting him to his target. His R, Chrono Break. Echo shatters his timeline, becoming untargetable and rewinding to a more favorable point in time. He returns to wherever he was a few seconds ago and heals for a percentage of the damage received in that duration. Enemies near his arrival zone take massive damage. And next up is Elise. Elise's role is a mage, and her difficulty is rated at 3 out of 3 stars. Her passive, Spider Queen. In her human form, when Elise's abilities hit an enemy, she gains a dormant spiderling. In her spider form, passive attacks deal bonus magic damage and restore health to Elise. Her Q, Neurotoxin, and Venomous Bite. In human form, deals damage based upon how high the target's health is. Spider form lunges at an enemy and deals damage based upon how low their health is. Her W, Volatile Spiderling and Skittering Frenzy. Human form releases a Venom Gorge Spiderling that explodes when it nears a target. Spider form, Elise and her spiderlings gain attack speed. Her E, Cocoon or Repel. Human form stuns the first enemy unit hit and reveals them if they are not stealthed. Spider form. Elise and her spiderlings ascend into the air and then descend upon a target enemy. After descending on a target enemy, Elise's bonus damage and healing from Spider Queen is increased. And lastly, her ult is her spider form. Elise transforms into a menacing spider, reducing her attack range in exchange for movement speed, new abilities, and a spiderling swarm that will attack her foes. Next up is Evelyn. Evelyn's role is an assassin and her difficulty is rated as 3 out of 3 stars. Her passive, Demon Shade. When out of combat, Evelyn enters Demon Shade. Demon Shade heals Evelyn when she is low on health and grants camouflage after level 6. Her Q, Hate Spike. Evelyn strikes out with her lasher, dealing damage to the first unit hit. Then, Evelyn can shoot a line of spikes at nearby foes up to 3 times. Her W, Allure. Evelyn curses her target, causing her next attack or spell after a delay to charm her enemy and reduce their magic resist. Her E, Whiplash. Evelyn whips her target with her lasher, dealing damage. She then gains movement speed for a short duration. Her R, Last Caress. Evelyn briefly goes untargetable and decimates the area in front of her before warping backwards a long distance. Next up, Ezreal. His role is a marksman and his difficulty is rated as 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Rising Spell Force. Ezreal gains increasing attack speed each time he successfully hits a spell, stacking up to 5 times. His Q, Passive Shot. Ezreal fires a damaging bolt of energy which reduces all of his cooldowns slightly if it strikes an enemy unit. His W, Essence Flux. Ezreal fires an orb that sticks to the first champion or objective hit. If Ezreal hits an enemy with the orb, it detonates and deals damage. And his E, Arcane Shift. Ezreal teleports to a target nearby location and fires a homing bolt which strikes the nearest enemy unit, prioritizes enemies struck with Essence Flux. And his ult, True Shot Barrage. Ezreal winds up before firing a powerful barrage of energy that deals massive damage to each unit it passes through. Damage is reduced for minions and non-epic monsters. Next up, Fiddlesticks. Fiddlesticks' role is a mage and his difficulty is 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, a harmless scarecrow. Fiddlesticks' trinket is replaced by scarecrow effigies. His Q, Terrify. Fiddlesticks nearby enemies with spells. Fiddlesticks damaging enemies with spells while unseen or targeting an enemy with terrifying activation strikes a target unit with fear, causing it to flee in terror for duration. His W, Bountiful Harvest. Fiddlesticks drains health from nearby enemies, dealing bonus execute damage at the end of the duration. His E, Reap. Fiddlesticks slashes an area with its scythe, slowing all enemies hit and silencing enemies hit in the center of the slash. His ult, Crowstorm. A murder of crows flock wildly around Fiddlesticks, dealing damage per second to all enemy units in the area. Next up, Fiora. Fiora's role is a fighter, and her difficulty is rated as 1 out of 3 stars, which is kind of interesting. Her passive, Duelist Dance. Fiora challenges nearby enemy champions to dodge her. She calls out direction, for which she will try to strike. If she can complete her own challenge, she receives a small bonus and calls out a new direction. Her Q, Lunge. Fiora lunges in a direction and stabs a nearby enemy, dealing physical damage and applying on-hit effects. Her W, Riposte. Fiora parries all incoming damage and disables for a short time, then stabs in a direction. The stab slows the first enemy champion hit or stuns him if Fiora blocked an immobilizing effect with this ability. Her E, Blade Work. Fiora has increased attack speed for the next 2 attacks. The The first attack slows the target and the second attack will critically strike. Her R, Grand Challenge. Fiora reveals all 4 vitals on an enemy champion and gains movement speed while near them. If Fiora hits all 4 vitals, or if the target dies after she has hit at least one, Fiora and her allies in the area are healed over for the next few seconds. Next up, Fizz. Fizz's role is an assassin and his difficulty is rated as 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Nimble Fighter, is Fizz can move through units and takes a flat amount of reduced damage from all sources. His Q, Urchin Spike. Fizz dashes through his target, dealing magic damage and applying on-hit effects. His W, Seastone Trident. Fizz's attacks bleed his enemies, dealing magic damage over several seconds. Fizz can empower his next attack to deal bonus damage and empower his further attacks for a short time. His E, Playful Trickster. Fizz hops into the air, landing gracefully upon his spear and becoming untargetable. From this position, Fizz can either slam the ground or choose to jump again before smashing back down. And his R, Chum the Waters. Fizz tosses a fish in a direction that attaches to any champion that touches it, slowing the target. After a short delay, a shark erupts from the ground, knocking up the target and knocking any nearby enemies aside. All enemies hit are dealt magic damage and slowed. Next up is Galio. Galio's role is a tank and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Colossal Smash. Every few seconds, Galio's next basic attack deals bonus magic damage in an area. His Q, Winds of War. Galio files 2 wind blasts that converge into a large tornado that deals damage over time. His W, Shield of Durand. Galio charges a defensive stance, moving slowly. Upon releasing the charge, Galio will taunt and damage nearby enemies. His E, Justice Punch. Galio will briefly step back and charge, knocking up the first enemy champion he encounters. His R, Hero's Entrance. Galio designates an ally's position as his landing spot, granting all allies in the area a magic shield. After a delay, Galio smashes down location, knocking up nearby enemies. Next up, Gangplank. Gangplank's role is a fighter, and his difficulty is rated 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, Trial by Fire. Every few seconds, Gangplank's melee strike will set his opponent on fire. His Q, Parley, shoots target splendor gold for each enemy unit healed. His W, Remove Scurvy. He eats a citrus to cure crowd control effects and restore health. His E, Powder Keg. Gangplank uncovers a powder keg at a target location. If he attacks it, it explodes, spreading the attack damage to enemies in the area, slowing them. His R, Cannon Barrage. Gangplank signals his ship to bombard an area, slowing and damaging enemies. Next up is Garen. Garen's role is a fighter and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Perseverance. If Garen has not recently been struck by damage or enemy abilities, he regenerates a % of his total health each second. His Q, Decisive Strike. Garen gains a burst of movement speed, breaking free of all slows affecting him. His next attack strikes a vital area of his foe, dealing bonus damage and silencing them. His W, Courage. Garen passively increases his armor and magic resist by killing enemies. He may also activate this ability to give him a shield and tenacity for a brief moment, followed by a lesser amount of damage reduction for a longer duration. His E, Judgment. Garen rapidly spins his sword around his body, dealing physical damage to nearby enemies. His R, Demacian Justice. Garen calls upon the might of Demacia to attempt to execute an enemy champion. Next up, we have Gnar. Gnar's role is a fighter and his difficulty is listed as 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, Rage Gene. When in combat, Gnar generates rage. At maximum rage, his next ability will transform him into Mega Gnar, granting increased survivability and access to new spells. His Q, Boomerang Throw or Boulder Toss. Gnar throws a boomerang that damages and slows enemies it hits before returning to him. If he catches the boomerang, its cooldown is reduced. Mega Gnar instead throws a boulder that stops on its first unit hit, damaging and slowing everything nearby. It can then be picked up to reduce the duration. His W, Hyper or Wallop. Gnar's attacks and spells hype him up, dealing bonus damage and granting him movement speed. Mega Gnar is too enraged to be hyper and instead can rear up on his hind legs and smash down on an area in front of him, stunning enemies in an area. His E, Hop or Crunch. Gnar leaps to a location and bounces off the head of any unit he lands on, traveling further. Mega Gnar is too large to bounce and instead lands with earth-shattering force, dealing damage in an area around him. R is Gnar. Mega Gnar throws everything around him in a chosen direction, dealing damage and slowing enemies. Any enemy that hits a wall is stunned and takes bonus damage. Next up is Gragas. Gragas' role is a fighter and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Happy Hour. Gragas periodically heals upon using a skill. His Q, Barrel Roll. Gragas rolls his cask to a location, which can be activated to explode or will explode on its own after 4 seconds. Enemies struck by the blast wave have their movement speed slowed. His W, Drunken Rage. Gragas guzzles down brew from his cask for 1 second. After finishing, he becomes drunkenly empowered, dealing magic damage to all nearby enemies on his next basic attack and reducing damage received. His E, Body Slam. Gragas charges to a location and collides with the first enemy unit he comes across, dealing damage to all nearby enemy units and stunning them. And his R, Explosive Cask. Gragas hurls his cask to a location, dealing damage and knocking back enemies caught in the blast radius. Next up is Graves. Graves' role is a marksman and his difficulty is 1 out of 3 stars. His passive, New Destiny. Graves' shotgun has some unique properties. He must reload when he runs out of ammo. Attacks fire 4 bullets, which cannot pass through enemies. Non-champions struck by multiple bullets are knocked back. End of the line. Graves fire an explosive shell that detonates after 2 seconds, or 0.2 seconds if it strikes terrain. His W, Smokescreen. Graves fires a smoke canister at the target area, creating a cloud of smoke that reduces sight range. Enemies caught in the initial impact are dealt magic damage and have their movement speed reduced briefly. His E, Quick Draw. Graves dashes forward, gaining an armor boost for several seconds. If Graves dashes towards an enemy champion, gain 2 stacks of True Grit instead. Hitting enemies with basic attacks lowers the cooldown of the skill and refreshes the resistance boost. And R, Collateral Damage. Graves fires an explosive shell, dealing heavy damage to the first champion it hits. After hitting a champion or reaching the end of its range, the shell explodes, dealing damage in a cone. Next up, Hecarim. Hecarim's role is a fighter, and his difficulty is rated as 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Warpath. Hecarim gains attack damage equal to a percentage of his bonus movement speed. His Q, Rampage. Hecarim cleaves nearby enemies, dealing physical damage. If Hecarim damages at least one enemy, he increases the damage and lowers the cooldown of subsequent rampages. His W, Spirit of Dread. Hecarim deals magic damage to nearby enemies for a short duration. Hecarim gains health equal to a percentage of any damage those enemies suffer. His E, Devastating Charge. Hecarim gains increasing movement speed and can knock through enemies for a short duration. His next attack knocks the target back and deals additional physical damage based on the distance he traveled since activating the ability. His R, Onslaught of Shadows. Hecarim summons Spectral Riders and charges forward, dealing magic damage in a line. Hecarim creates a shockwave when he finishes his charge, causing nearby enemies to flee in terror. Next up, Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger's role is a mage, and his difficulty is rated as 3 out of 3 stars. His passive, Hextech Affinity, gain movement speed while near allied turrets, near allied towers and turrets deployed by Heimerdinger. His Q, H28G Evolution Turret. Heimerdinger lays down a rapid-fire cannon turret equipped with a secondary pass-through beam attack. His W, Hextech Micro Rockets. Heimerdinger fires a long-range rocket that converges on his cursor. His E, CH2 Electron Storm Grenade. Heimerdinger lobs a grenade at a location, dealing damage to enemy units as well as stunning anyone directly hit and slowing surrounding units. His ult, Upgrade. Heimerdinger invents an upgrade, causing his next spell to have increasing effects. Next up, Alawi. Alawi's role is a fighter and her difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. Her passive, Prophet of an Elder God. Alawi and the vessel she creates spawns tentacles on nearby impassable terrain. Tentacles swing at spirits, vessels, and victims of Alawi's harsh lesson. Tentacles deal physical damage to enemies hit and will heal Alawi if they damage a champion. Q, Tentacle Smash. Increase the damage dealt by tentacles. When activated, Alawi smashes down a tentacle that deals physical damage. W, Harsh Lesson. Alawi leaps to a target, dealing physical damage and causing nearby tentacles to also swing at the target. E, Test of Spirit. Alawi rips the spirit from a foe's body, forcing it to stand before her. Spirits echo a percentage of the damage they take to the original target. If killed, or if the target gets too far away from the spirit, the target will become a vessel and begin spawning tentacles. R, Leap of Faith. Alawi smashes her idol into the ground, dealing physical damage to nearby enemies. A tentacle spawns for each enemy champion hit. Next up, Aurelia. Aurelia's role is a fighter, and she is rated as 2 out of 3 stars in terms of difficulty. Her passive, Ionian Fervor. When Aurelia strikes enemies with spells, she gains stacking bonus attack speed. At maximum stacks, she also gains bonus magic on hit. Her Q, Blade Surge. Aurelia dashes forward to strike her target, healing herself. If the target is marked or dies to Blade Surge, its cooldown refreshes. Her W, Defiant Dance. Aurelia charges a strike that deals more damage as she charges. She takes reduced physical damage during the charge. Her E, Flawless Duet. Aurelia sends 2 blades which converge on each other. Enemies caught in between are damaged, stunned, and marked. Her R, Vanguard's Edge. Aurelia fires a massive number of blades that explode outwards upon hitting an enemy champion. Enemies hit by the blades are damaged and marked. Afterwards, the blades form a wall that will damage and slow enemies that walk through it. Next up is Ivern. Ivern's role is a support, and his difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. His passive, Friend of the Forest, is that Ivern cannot attack or be attacked by non-epic monsters. Ivern can create magical growths on jungle camps, which grow over time. When the growth is fully grown, Ivern may free the monsters to receive gold and experience. After level 5, Ivern can share jungle buffs with allies. His Q, Root Collar, Ivern conjures a vine, dealing damage and rooting enemy targets hit. Ivern allies can dash to the rooted target. His W, Brushmaker. In Brush, Ivern's attack deal bonus magic damage. Ivern can activate this ability to create a patch of brush. His E, Trigger Seed. Ivern places a shield on an ally which explodes after a short duration, slowing and damaging enemies. His R, Daisy. Ivern summons his sentinel friend Daisy to fight with him. Daisy will send out a shockwave if she attacks the same champion 3 times in a row. Next up is Janna. Janna's role is a support and her difficulty is 2 out of 3 stars. Her passive, Tailwind. Janna passively gains bonus movement speed, and nearby ally champions gain this bonus when moving towards her. Additionally, Janna's basic attacks cause additional magic damage based on her bonus movement speed. Her Q, Howling Gale. By creating a localized change in pressure and temperature, Janna is able to create a small storm that grows in size with time. She can activate the spell again to release the storm. On release, the storm will fly towards the direction it was cast in, dealing damage and knocking away any enemies in path. Her W, Zephyr. Janna summons an air elemental that passively increases her movement speed and enables her to pass through units. She may also activate this ability to deal damage and slow enemies' movement speed. The passive is lost while this ability is on cooldown. Her E, Eye of the Storm. Janna conjures a defensive gale that shields an allied champion or turret from incoming damage and increases their attack range. Her R, Monsoon. Janna surrounds herself in a magical storm, throwing enemies back. After the storm has settled, soothing winds heal nearby allies while the ability is active. Thank you everyone who listened to this entire video. This is part 1. Part 2 and 3 will be out, well, part 2 will be out within 2 to 3 days. And we will pick up with Draven. Thank you so much. Goodbye.